My guest today is Professor Bhismadev Chakrabarti, who's Professor of Neuroscience and Mental Health at the University of Reading. He studies the mechanisms and processes underlying human social behavior and individual differences therein. Welcome, Bhishma.
Thank you. Thank you, Gil.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So, we are going to talk about autism, and I guess it is now called Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD. And it is, I suspect, quite prevalent in the world. Is the prevalence rate all over the world is about 1% on average?
So that is the most robust figure from across the countries, but there is huge difference between different countries.
And so, do you have a sense of where the prevalence rates are high? A cluster of countries or something like that?
So I think to understand that question and really appreciate the differences between countries, it's worth keeping in mind that all the countries do not necessarily use the same goalposts to
Mm,
define autism. So,
mm,
for example, the CDC in the US till last year, they were talking about 1 in 55 and then 1 in 36 or something like that. So, something that's a remarkably high figure
mm,
for autism spectrum conditions. Whereas if you look at the population level prevalence studies done in India, uh, the highest numbers are more around the 1% mark, and when we studied it in school children, that was less than that. Now, it's always dependent on what is being defined as autism, and that what you've hinted at is the inclusion of the spectrum kind of creates slightly flexible goalposts.
mm.
And that has implications for how we talk about autism.
So the ASD diagnosis, is it a score since it's a spectrum?
So one thing that we like to believe in, and I would imagine that that is more or less an emerging view within the field, that autism represents the end of a dimension that exists in the general population. So it's not quite like, say, one example would be a very strongly genetic condition like cystic fibrosis. So if you have a certain genetic variation, or sometimes called mutation, you would have that diagnosis of cystic fibrosis. If you do not have it, you will not have. Autism is not quite like that, that it's not a categorical kind of entity that you suddenly have or you don't have. Instead, what we might have is everyone in the population is somewhere on the spectrum, the dimensions that define the spectrum. Now, if you are at the end where you are having more the challenges in your day-to-day lives, then you might go and seek a diagnosis from a clinician or seek some kind of support with your daily life. At that point, you might get a diagnosis. So we should not really think of those people who get a diagnosis as the only kind of truly autistic people, and those who do not have a formal diagnosis are really not autistic and completely different from them. So we have to have the dimensional lens through which we perceive that spectrum.
Yeah, so I don't know much about this, Bhishma, but I'm fond of saying everybody is on the ASD, everybody is on the autism spectrum. And as you say, it is a question of which part of that spectrum you are, in terms of whether you should seek a diagnosis or in severe cases, seek treatment. So I want to go into the study. So the first one that you have using mobile health technology to assess childhood autism in low resource community settings in India, an innovation to address a detection gap. So you say here a diagnosis of autism typically depends on clinical assessments by highly trained professionals. The high resource demand poses a challenge in low resource settings. Digital assessment of neurodevelopmental symptoms by non-specialists provides a potential avenue to address this challenge. This cross-sectional case-controlled field study establishes proof of principle for such a digital assessment. Yeah, so this makes a lot of sense. 1.4 billion people, and all sorts of economic strata, all sorts of educational strata. It is really an experiment in diversity in many ways. And something like ASD, there is social stigma associated with it. And so to take the kid to a specialist may not be a top priority for most parents to get a diagnosis. So so yeah, talk a bit about the study and the protocols and what you're doing there.
Sure. I'll before I come to the study, I just want to kind of touch upon the point that you raised before, that when you said that you think of everybody as somewhere on the autism spectrum. The analogy that I quite like is the analogy of height. So
Mm.
everyone has some height, right? And we don't talk of height as height spectrum disorders. We talk
Yes.
of height.
Yeah.
So that's why I actually don't like the term disorder, because it kind of almost kind of contributes to the stigma in some way that this dimension is something to be kind of worried about. But if we now, even with something as innocuous as height, we
Mm.
have the situation that if somebody is, say, 7.5 feet tall, or somebody is just 1.5 foot tall, these people will have problems in their daily lives. These people will have challenges than most of us will than what we experience as those who are kind of in the, say, 4 to 6 feet zone, or 4 to 6.5 feet zone.
Yeah.
So so a dimension that exists in the general population can also present problems for those who are in the extreme ends of the dimension.
Mm.
Similarly, autistic traits, autistic symptoms, those who are in the more extreme end, the high extreme end of the dimension, might and most often do experience more problems than those who are in the middle of the dimension. Now comes the question, the second analogy that I really like. So when we think about light, uh, if you if you pass the light through a prism, it breaks into multiple colors, right? So if you think of autistic symptomatic continuum as a beam of light, we are trying to find the prism that breaks it down to the component dimensions.
Mm.
So one component dimension would be the social the social emotional dimension of it. So how well do we understand other people? How much do we prefer to look at other people and other social stimuli? Another dimension would be how much do I respond to sensory stimuli? If there are a certain tactile stimuli, say clothes tags and things that bother me more than
Mm.
what they do to other people. Uh, then there are motor symptoms as well. Like, am I do I find it more difficult to kind of coordinate my motor actions with the sensory input that I'm getting? So what we call sensory motor integration. These are some of the dimensions that uh, capture the variability in the autistic spectrum. So it's literally a spectrum. So these are some of the component dimensions, but we are still trying to work out what those other components might be, whether these components are completely independent of each other or not. So this is something that's a very active area of work.
Mm.
Now, having said that, this is kind of the theoretical position from where we operate, that these are the component dimensions, then the question comes of how we measure them. And that's where the study that you referred to uh, kind of features quite strongly. That's the kind of theoretical framework from within which we designed the study. So um, I if it's okay, I'll give you a little bit of the historical
Sure.
background to that study
Sure.
before I go in to what we did in that study.
Yeah.
So a while back, we tried to estimate the prevalence of autism in Indian school children.
Mm.
And in order to do that, we had to translate and validate a bunch of questionnaire and clinical observation based tools in local languages and cross-validated and back translated and all the kind of rigmarole that comes with adapting a tool for a different culture. And we
This is
did that.
this is a study with 12,000 or so school children,
That's right. Yes.
and so the instrument is a survey in that case, or
It
something.
is a three-stage study. So the first was a survey with a short questionnaire in parents and teachers. The second was those who met cutoff on those questionnaires from both parents and teachers. Then they would be kind of doing a much more intensive survey of autistic features and parent-reported autistic features. Then those who meet cutoff on that will then go through a clinical interview, a structured interview called the ADOS. So it was a three-stage process. And it took us a really long time to get through all of those different stages. And this was, as you said, 12,000 children in Kolkata. One of the things we realized that this approach required clinical psychologists to be administering these various tests, and that really does not scale well. And
Yeah.
because it does not scale, because I mean, we were doing the study in Kolkata, which is one of the metropolitan cities, so there was no dearth of psychologists. But you step out of Kolkata, and suddenly finding postgraduate clinical psychologists becomes a real challenge. So, so we were kind of realizing that if we have to do this large scale phenotyping or assessment of autistic features in the field, then we cannot really be relying on instruments that require specialist administration.
Yeah.
And sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, no, no. I'm just going to say, I think we talk about this. So this is, as you say, it's a multifactorial condition. A lot of different things, different parts of the system of the human being, and a lot of features in those things. And so it seems very amenable to some sort of a machine learning type assessment, right?
Well, I mean, that's the kind of holy grail that everybody has been trying for, and including us. So, and I think, but even before we get to machine learning, there is a kind of more practical challenge to address, and that is that we have to find a tool that can be administered by people who are non-specialists. It should not require specialist administration because then it will not scale properly.
Yeah.
And that led to our project, the one that you were talking about, which we called START.
Mhm.
So it stands for Screening Tools for Autism Risk Using Technology. The, the acronym is slightly dated. We don't like to talk about autism risk anymore. We talk about autism likelihood, but
Yeah.
START doesn't sound as nice as START. So we stuck with START. Now, the way what START does is to try and design tasks, simple tasks that we have kind of got data from in lab-based settings. We have tried to take those tasks and convert them into app-based versions of it. So one example would be one of the common examples is that of a preferential looking task. So many autistic children and adults, if you present them with uh, a video of a social stimulus, a social situation on one side of the screen. So something like, say, two people chatting to each other or a bunch of kids playing versus a non-social video on the other side of the screen. So these are two videos being presented simultaneously to two sides of the screen. And the non-social video could be something like wheels turning or the washing machine whirring or something like that. Many autistic people prefer to look at the non-social compared to the social stimuli.
Mm.
This type of this type of experiment is called a preferential looking experiment, and commonly when we do it in the lab, we use an infrared eye tracker to record the eye movements to know where a child or an adult is looking. The one of the big kind of innovations that we used in the Start app was to use the front camera of the tablet. In fact, just like what is being used to show me and you at this point,
Mm.
we are using pretty much the front camera of the tablet to look at where a person is looking while they're looking at the screen. So we are doing tablet-based eye tracking in field settings.
Yeah.
And that gives us a very robust marker of the social preference or lack thereof in individuals and children. So this is one of the tasks within the Start battery. Then there
Mm.
is another task that comes from a sensory preference assessment. Now, many autistic children really like looking at spinning patterns, spinning wheels, or
Mm.
spinning patterns, so much so that they might often look at it for a very long time, and they might also try and come close to the screen or look at it from the side of their eyes or something like that. So it might represent a kind of a stimulus which is a very predictable stimulus, and this predictable repeating motion is
Mm.
something they often many autistic children are often drawn to. So we designed a task within the Start battery where we have a wheel with spinning contours, and there is a small red button next to the screen, which we tell the child while testing that, here's the spinning wheel. At any point that you don't want to see it, just press the red button and it will stop.
Mm.
That's the only instruction. Um, and while the children are looking at the wheel, we are, of course, measuring the time they take before they press a button, but we also record the video of the child on how close do they come to the screen, or do they rock back and forth while looking at the screen. And
Mm.
all of those features are recorded in the back end. So the Start battery effectively kind of captures uh, such features like the social features that I talked about, the sensory feature that I just mentioned, and then there are some motor tasks as well where we test for how well they can integrate visual and motor information. And all of these all of these features together, in addition to some simple parent questionnaire data that comes from the some of the questionnaires that we translated back in the day, all of these together, we then throw it into a machine learning mix. So you mentioned machine learning. So and in the paper that you were referring to, this was done in about just under 150 children in three groups. One a group with autism, one a group with intellectual disability, and another non-autistic, non-intellectual disabled kids,
Mm.
all done in home settings and in and around Delhi. So this is very much field data, and importantly, the the platform was always administered by non-specialist health workers. So these some of these health workers were school dropouts. So this is absolutely this is a big change from, say, the postgraduate psychologists who administered the prevalence study.
They're not manually picking up any data, right? I would imagine the app will store
Yeah,
all the data.
yeah. So
Okay.
all they're trained on is how to administer the task, and then the tablet collects the data, and then they upload the data to a central server. Then once the data is collected in the central server, then there are analysis scripts. That's kind of the whole thing is centralized. At that point, we can analyze and identify where a child is vis-a-vis a particular dimension that's relevant to autism. One of the things that we have deliberately tried and avoided, and I am still kind of a bit skeptical about that, is we have avoided it being kind of released in the, say, the App Store in Google or Apple, because it, then it becomes, I mean, without that training in how to administer and without that training in how to interpret the data, people might start self-diagnosing and kind of worrying themselves more than they need to. So I think there's a deliberate choice on our part not to make it such that, people can just download and start diagnosing themselves.
Yeah, unless the backend algorithm gets really good. So in some sense, all you need is to use the app, and the
Mhm,
app then will give you some feedback.
mhm,
And it's not a diagnosis per se. It might be, some risk metric that one may want to take a look at. I think that could be quite beneficial. I mean, in the context of India, the problem there is the sheer numbers that I don't know, 330 million households in the country, and I don't know what percentage of them actually may have some sort of autistic kid in the household. Do you have a general idea what that might be in India?
Well, I mean, if we go with the 1% mark, I mean, you could just kind of do the math, like 1.2 billion, and 1% of that is more than 12 million people, right? So that's quite a lot of people, and this is assuming these are in distinct households. So, and very often, one of the things that we often don't realize is that one I mean, having an autistic person in your family, it's not just a challenge for the autistic person himself or herself. It often is presents challenges for the family members, or even the people that the autistic person has to interact with. So it is in everybody's interest that the autistic people get the maximum support, because if they do not get the support, that is a lose-lose situation for everyone.
Mm. So in the previous study, that the study that you mentioned, the school children study with an N of about 12,000, these are school children. And if I remember correctly, the prevalence that you came up with in that process is only about 0.2% or something like that, right?
0.26, yeah.
0.26. So, as you say in the study, obviously, this is in West Bengal, in Kolkata specifically, with about 79% or so enrollment in the school. So one could reasonably assume the other 21% either just cannot go to school, or there might be something preventing them from going to school, right? So the prevalence in that remaining percentage could be quite high. That might bring it up to that average 1% for 10.
Absolutely. That's exactly how we interpreted it as well. We I think we use the word that we this should be considered the lower bound of the true prevalence because of our design. I mean, again, historical aside, if I'm allowed, then is that we originally did not want to stick to school children alone. We recognize that, by designing a study that's only focusing on school children, we would miss those children who don't go to school. And just to kind of give you a very simple kind of uh, split between the countries, say UK and India, these are two countries that I work a lot in. Um, in UK, about 80% of children with a diagnosis who have an official diagnosis of autism go to a mainstream school.
Mm,
Whereas in the UK, in India, uh, about 80% of children with a diagnosis of autism do not go to school.
mm,
So wherever it's been kind of studied, so it effectively it or go to a special school. So do not go to a mainstream school. That is.
yeah.
So even though in our study in the 2017 paper that you're talking about, we did include a special school that was part of the sample, but it was because we were geographically restricted to three boroughs, we couldn't just go and sample every special school in all of Kolkata. And the other aspect is that's particularly tricky in the Indian setting is that children do not always go to the school that's closest to them. Like, for example, in the UK, there is a general principle of catchment area in schools. Like, you would not go to a school that's more than, I think, 2.5 miles or 5 miles, something like that, between. So, when you are when you're kind of say measuring the data from a bunch of schools in the UK, you have a very clear idea of the geographic region from where the kids are coming. Whereas if you do that in Kolkata or any Indian city, sometimes parents would send their children to a school that's supposed to be a really good school or something from a very far away place, so that the child would possibly have a 1.5 hour commute to get to the school every day, whereas other children might come from a very short distance. So focusing on the school in a specific borough is not really representative of the municipal borough per se. So that geographic flexibility in schools in India, and this becomes a very kind of practical issue, that how much can you really infer about the population. So yeah, that's kind of one aspect of it, that we definitely believe that if we have a door-to-door survey, and there have been a door-to-door study, there has been one door-to-door study in 4,000 children from different parts of India, and they have come up with around the 1% figure. This was since we published ours. I think this was a few years later. They published something around the 1% mark.
Yeah. I want to ask you something. This is not in your research, but I recently saw, a categorization. It's called AUDHD, which is a combination of autism and ADHD. As you mentioned, in the US, perhaps the diagnosis and interventions are potentially at a much higher level, and a part of that is the ADHD sort of interacting with autism. Do you see that elsewhere, or do you see that as an issue?
So I think one aspect to keep in mind is that before the last version of DSM-5, which we use for diagnosis, autism and ADHD were mutually exclusive diagnoses. So you could not have an ADHD diagnosis if you had autism, and vice versa. Um, and that was somewhat arbitrary. And people realized, and clinicians across the globe, they realized that that's kind of problematic, because many autistic people also have very high ADHD symptoms. So opening up that uh, that possibility of comorbid, we call it comorbidity or co-occurrence of ADHD and autism, that has kind of given that's given rise to this rise of AUDHD, the ODHD diagnosis. I do not see it as I do not see it as a new phenomenon. I mean, it's only been started, it's only been recognized more recently, but there is no reason to believe that it did not exist before 2013, and suddenly something changed in 2013, which brought these individuals, or which brought these symptoms manifest themselves. So these symptoms would have been there all along, and it's just that they got recognized after 2013. Now, having said that, I mean, one of the things that is worth keeping in mind is this, and because you mentioned this rise in the ODHD diagnosis as well, and the US, we started talking with the US having these very high numbers of autism spectrum diagnosis. One of the things that we often wonder about is what are the factors that's driving these this rise in numbers now, and there seem to be multiple different factors at play. I mean, of course, there is an increased recognition and awareness of people, and who would then come and seek a clinical diagnosis. But within even within that particular process, one has to think about the sociological reality, especially in US. If you see the autism diagnosis rise before the insurance companies started recognizing it as something that they would be they can reimburse for or pay towards interventions for, and after the recognition. So before insurance recognition, after insurance recognition, that makes a big difference in in the rise of people seeking out autism diagnosis and also being given autism diagnosis, autism spectrum diagnosis, that is. Similarly, if you look at India, uh, before the Autism Act became part of became ratified by the parliament and became law, uh, autism was not really part of. I mean, an autism diagnosis did not give you any access to services in India before the act got really incorporated. Uh, and then once the autism recognition got incorporated within the rights of persons with disabilities, and it gave you basically a passport to services, suddenly you see this rise in recognition and people going and seeking diagnosis. I've been told by my clinician colleagues in India that this is well over 10 years ago, and this is before autism was these kind of legal changes happened, so that autism became well recognized and supported through government services. My clinician colleagues in India would tell me that, parents would often ask them for a mental retardation diagnosis so that they can access the services when the child is clearly not mentally retarded. Possibly the child has super high IQ in that particular case. And but you can realize, so we must realize, we must look at these rising rates of whatever diagnosis it is within each country through the lens of the socio-economic, cultural, and political realities, and not just think of it as a biological phenomenon alone.
Yeah, there could also be other factors involved here, right? So, rising rates might also imply that, and we'll talk about empathy and emotion regulation. Rising rates might also imply that, the emotional construct of people or their empathetic feelings, things like that have been potentially declining. And if so, if there is some sort of an intersection there, you would imagine these types of diagnosis to go up. But I want to ask you: is there an effective intervention for autism?
Well, uh, there are a few things that we know. So uh, I would like to bring you back to the dimensional model again. So depending on which element of the dimension that we're talking about, so if it is the social skills or social awareness, social regulation element of autism, then if the difficulties or the challenges are recognized early enough in children, and there are some really useful markers that one can watch out for, if these are spotted early enough, then there are behavioral support and intervention programs, both mediated by specialists as well as parent-supported behavioral intervention programs, that have shown very good evidence that in that dimension, the children can make lots of progress. But the key to the progress is identifying their level of functioning early enough. So without early detection, you cannot have early intervention. And we know early intervention has a good impact. So, and similarly, when we think about, so that's the social behavioral aspect. Then you might have motor behavioral issues as well. And again, for those ones, or motor or sensory issues, having an early intervention with an occupational therapist can make a big difference. But the key word here in both of these cases that we have to try and identify as early as possible and intervene. We should not necessarily wait for a formal diagnosis of autism. Often the diagnosis becomes the bottleneck that people wait for, oh, let's have a formal diagnosis before we start intervening. If we know that a child is having difficulties or not meeting the milestones in their motor behavior, or their social behavior is not quite what we would expect for that age, there is no harm in getting into behavioral intervention territory. It is not like a pharmacological drug that will have a side effect and that will really break things in some way. It's in the cost of a false negative is very little in this one.
Yeah, yeah. But there are no drugs, right? There are no CNS.
No, nothing that, yeah, no kind of, no one pill for anything. I mean, there are aspects, for example, there are aspects of if you have autism comorbid with OCD, and if you are an adult, there are specific drugs that will take care of the OCD symptoms at a periodically. Or if you're an autistic teenager with high anxiety, then there are anxiety reducing pharmacological approaches. But I would about the core features of autism, the core dimensions of autism, there aren't really any pharmacological candidates that show very strong evidence in any way.
So early diagnosis and early behavioral modifications seem to be the best thing we could do. And so
Absolutely.
diagnosis part become really important.
I would
That's
say
part of
early identification of
identification.
the
Yeah,
needs rather
yeah,
than diagnosis in a clinical diagnosis with like a certificate or something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I want to go into another paper, which is somewhat related. Empathy and emotion regulation, an integrative account. It might be a book chapter. I don't know, Bhishma.
Yes.
You say here how we understand and respond to others' emotions, i.e., empathy, may be influenced by the regulatory processes that are used to shape which emotions we and others have. Emotion regulation. Empathy and emotion regulation are complex multidimensional constructs, and the relationship between the component processes is not well characterized. Yeah, I'm remembering, Bishma, recently a CEO of a big auto company in the US said empathy is killing Western culture, and he should know. And so this is where I was sort of driving at, which is if we find longitudinally empathy in society is declining, let's say I'm just making this up, we would find increased incidences of things like ASD. I would think. I'm just speculating here. What do you think about that?
Well, this is a it's a very intriguing statement to think about. Like, I wish there was a kind of proper longitudinal study at a population level to see whether our empathy is truly declining. And then, I mean, these things are like fractals. And why I say fractals, because I talked about autism being a beam of light, and then you pass it through a prism, and then suddenly you get the social, and then you get motor, then you get sensory, and so on and so forth. But let's take that social element, and maybe that beam is an empathy beam. So empathy within that social element, there is one aspect of empathy, how much you understand another person and how you respond to them. Now you pass the empathy beam through another prism. Now it breaks further down. It breaks down into cognitive empathy, which is an inferential aspect of empathy. And the example of that, say, if I know that you have woken up really early to have this meeting with me, then I might be, and if I've already known this, then I might be able to make better sense of your mental state or your physical state. So because I would be then engaging in a certain level of inference that Gill must have woken up early. He's in a different time zone, and in order to make this time, he must have kind of had to kind of sleep much less than what he normally sleeps, and so on and so forth. So this we do automatically without speaking, right?
Yeah.
And this is this is an example of cognitive empathy. The other fraction is affective empathy, which is not inferential, which is a direct mapping of your emotion state onto my emotion state, possibly mediated through visible signals like facial expression. So if you are smiling and there is a certain degree of direct motor mapping of your smile onto my face, and I don't really need to know why you're smiling and what might be going on, but that's all. So that's the affective empathy bit. In very young children, even newborns, you see this phenomenon all the time. If one child cries, another child starts crying without realizing why they're crying. And this aspect of empathy stays with us even when we grow much older. The cognitive empathy becomes more and more important. And then there is an aspect of empathy which involves us helping other people. So if somebody is in a distress situation, then what we do to relieve them of their distress, that involves pro-social behavior. So when we say whether empathy is declining across years, that question then becomes a trifurcated question, because you say, well, is it that the inferential component is declining? Are people less able to infer what the other person must be going through? And I would say possibly not. There is no reason to believe that our inferential capacity as a species would be declining. Uh, is it that our affective empathy is declining, in the sense that do we map another person's emotions less on ourselves? I mean, that's a testable proposition. We don't really know. But do we now, the third component is pro-social behavior declining? Is it like what I do to relieve my kind of conspecific, another person that I don't know, a stranger, from their distress situation? Is that those kind of behaviors, are they declining? Maybe yes. I mean, if I had to hedge a bet on if empathy is declining, and that's a testable proposition, we do not know the answer to that. If I had to hedge a bet about these three components of empathy, I would say it is pro-social behavior that might be declining across across the ages. But this is an idea for an excellent experiment at a population level. We'll have to do that at some point.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, Bhishma, the cognitive empathy requires some level of cognitive processing, some level of focus, some level of concentration, some level of analysis. So, in a society with increasing ADHD, and this is all pure speculation, you would find, I would think, ADHD is a little bit of a symptom that you cannot really focus and have, cognitively assess the other person's state, so to speak, right?
So that's a slightly kind of tricky one to infer, because i- having high ADHD symptoms does not necessarily mean that you lack in intelligence in any way. And intelligence is crucial for your being able to infer another person's mental state. I mean, the the fundamental requirement in cognitive empathy is that you need to hold multiple representations simultaneously. So, for example, the simplest example would be the situation that we are in right now. I know that where I am having this interview from, that is late evening. And I know that where you are sitting, you are in possibly afternoon, in early afternoon or mid afternoon.
It's late night for you.
It's late night for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the fact that I can keep both of these representations about two individuals, what I believe about my kind of surroundings is one construct, and what you believe about your surroundings is another construct. The fact that I can hold these distinct beliefs about the two different people that we are here simultaneously in my head, that is essential for cognitive empathy. um, I mean, another term that often gets used in this context is theory of mind. That uh, you need that for something as simple as deception. So if a child is engaging in deception, if they're trying to fool you, or if they're trying, so that is a very healthy sign actually, because
Yeah.
that means they know what you believe to be true is different from what they believe to be true. That means they are simultaneously holding two representations and trying to fool you with something else. So uh, and that is that kind of gives you, that's a proof of the fact that inferential capacities are working.
Yeah. So in the paper, I think I don't have it in front of me. Um, there's some correlation between emotions and cognitive empathy, and
Right, yeah.
potentially a different type of correlation between emotions and affective empathy.
That's
Right? So
right.
could
Yeah. So
yeah.
I'll tell you, this all comes from our theoretical uh, paper. And again, a short historical aside on this is that we were working on empathy for a while. This is our lab-based work, not the app-based work or the field-based work that I talked about in India. In the lab, we were working a lot on empathy and its mechanisms. And one of the things about empathy research is that it's always about uh, understanding another person's emotion state. So if how well do I understand your emotion state, how do I respond to that emotion state? That's the standard structure of these experiments. But I mean, increasingly, I felt that it's kind of only one side of the story if we focus on the other person. Now, I might be. Let's imagine that you are. Let's imagine if you are crying, and I empathize with you, and I understand why you're crying, or I even embody some of your sad emotion onto my own face and body. Then things don't stop at that, right? I don't just say empathize. I empathize, and I then that's the end of the story. I then have to deal with the emotion that I have caught on from you,
Mm.
and I have to regulate it. So the way I came across this was actually observing a friend of mine, and she just had a child, and the child was crying, and she got really distressed because, and I could see this is like clear case of very high affective empathy,
Mm.
that the child's distress is causing the mom distress. But then it becomes a challenge for her to regulate her own emotion so
Mm.
that she can then help the child. So empathy and emotion regulation have to work hand in hand. And the studies that you were referring to, we found, this is a series of 2 or 3 different studies where we found that those individuals who had high cognitive empathy, trait cognitive empathy, whether you measure it using questionnaire based measures, or whether you measure it using kind of slightly kind of complex task measure, where we measure how quickly can you take another person's perspective visually. This is using an eye tracker. Uh, so whether you measure it using a task, or whether you measure it using a questionnaire, people high in cognitive empathy also were good in regulating their own emotions
Yeah.
well, because effectively being high in cognitive empathy needs you to be able to take multiple perspectives simultaneously,
Mm.
and those individuals were also able to regulate their own emotions well. On the other hand, if you were high in affective empathy,
Mm.
then what essentially ends up happening is that you might catch on another person's emotion quite a lot, and it's not necessarily helpful for regulation because you just have more of your emotion, your own emotion, to deal with at that point. So so the relationship between empathy and emotion regulation depends on the fraction of empathy that we are talking about.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting, Bhishma. So I know that it's really late for you. So in conclusion, do you want to mention any sort of future research direction that you're thinking about or excited about?
Absolutely. One of the things that we're trying to work out, what I started with really, is to try and look at how these different dimensions within the autistic spectrum, I mean, how, and we want to try and fractionate them as far as possible and make it as granular as possible. How are they related to each other, or are they really distinct from each other? Because, we think of, say, the social dimension as a distinct kind of fraction, and then the motor dimension as a distinct fraction. But if you think of it from a developmental lens, your social behaviors often rely on a motor apparatus. So, developmentally, if your motor behavior is not going too well in an early childhood, then your social behaviors will be affected as well.
Mm.
So, the relationship between these different component dimensions, how they evolve across time, is something that I'm, as an intellectual interest, that's kind of, I think that's something I'm going to be studying and be kind of pursuing in the future. But also, I'm excited about some of the work that we are doing with the STREAM project, which is where we've gone beyond autism and trying to create something like what we call reference curves. I mean, something similar to growth charts that you have for height and weight. Like, a child is this age, this is their age, and this should be their height, this should be their weight. We are now trying to create similar reference curves for social development, motor development, and cognitive development in India and also in Malawi. We have just finished that study. So one of the things that we are really excited in is trying to analyze that data and seeing whether we can create these reference curves for different dimensions of neurodevelopment.
Yes, one thing that went through my mind when we were talking is that it seems like I'm not a medical professional, or it seems like there's some sort of information processing deficit. So when I look at somebody's face, the amount of information I'm taking in is a tremendous amount of information. Contrast that with some mechanical thing like a truck or something. It's just much less amount of information. So are we, in some sense, the issue here is information processing speed, quantity? I don't know. Is there any evidence to it that?
So I think people have been trying to break it down, that what exactly separates social and non-social stimuli. Is it just that, there are just many more degrees of freedom in a social stimulus compared to non-social? But there is an element of that. That's true. But there is also an element of evolutionary preparedness, so to say. Like, throughout evolution, if individuals have there's a much higher probability of individuals seeing face-like objects or human conspecifics, much more than, say, a very complex array of nuts and bolts and levers. Then people would develop across generations. They would develop a natural kind of heuristic or kind of a processing style for this group of stimuli. Uh, and I know this sounds a little bit like hand waving when we don't really know how this evolutionary preparedness comes along, but the more and more we try and compare social versus non-social stimuli, it cannot just be explained by the informational complexity alone. Because even when we were talking about, the preferential looking studies that I mentioned, the lab-based studies that we had done looking at social versus non-social stimuli, we matched them on stimulus complexity on 17 different low-level parameters and their combinations to make sure that the social and non-social are really, and including like luminosity, contrast, local contrast, global contrast, everything. And even if you keep all of those kind of parameters matched, they still don't explain the difference between what we see in looking patterns between social and non-social. So there is something about socialness that captures people's interest differentially to non-social.
Yeah, very interesting research, Bishma, and there is still a lot to be researched.
Absolutely.
So excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gil. Thank you. Bye bye now.
Bye.